I began speaking the moment the data surfaced because hesitation felt dishonest. The structure inside 3i Atlas is not a trick of the telescope, not a miscalibrated detector, and not a smear of cosmic dust masquerading as geometry. What we uncovered, what I am staring at on this screen, should not exist inside any natural interstellar object. The polarization map refuses to behave like that of a cometary nucleus. Instead of chaotic scattering, the light curves bend into a deliberate pattern, as if something inside the object is organizing the photons as they escape. When we stripped away the coma and dust tail using a reconstruction algorithm originally built for exoplanet imaging, a silhouette rose from the noise floor. I watched it sharpen with every computational pass. A lattice, not an accidental cluster of fractures. An ordered, repeating topology of intersecting lines and nodes stretching across the core of 3i Atlas like scaffolding inside a hollow machine. I didn't say anything at first. I simply stared, knowing this would trigger a scientific earthquake. I pushed the saturation higher. The silhouette responded by outlining itself with uncanny symmetry. No natural fragmentation model predicts internal geometry this precise. The angles, the ratios between nodes, the alignment across axes, none of it matches the stochastic signatures of icy rubble or carbonaceous rock. The object behaves as though it contains a crystalline architecture assembled with intention. Minutes later, spectroscopic analysis arrived from the EELT array. I opened the file expecting noise or ambiguous features. Instead, the first spike at 8 microns nearly made me curse out loud. It resembled the vibrational pattern of superconducting lattices we synthesize in clean rooms. Yet this signal carried a coherence impossible for material drifting through cold interstellar vacuum for millions of years. Something is stabilizing it. Something is maintaining its order. The thought formed faster than I wanted to admit. This might not just be a crystalline structure, it might be a crystalline processor, a brain in the most literal sense, not biological, not digital, but physical logic encoded in matter that uses superconductivity as its medium. If such a network were meant to store or transmit information, its internal nodes would behave like registers or synaptic junctions. And the polarization anomalies we first detected, they could be leakage, bleed off from processes still occurring inside, even after centuries of drifting silent through the void. I enlarged the latest reconstruction. There, beneath the primary lattice, was a secondary layer, thinner, fainter, almost like filigree, a substructure embedded within the parent geometry. The ratio between the two layers matched harmonic intervals found in engineered signal matrices, not organic, not environmental, constructed. But then the opposing argument struck me with equal force. Could this be a natural exotic phase of matter, something produced in the death throes of collapsed stars, ejected as fragments carrying imprinted geometry from magnetic shear fields? We have never observed such a process, but that doesn't mean the universe is obligated to stay within the limits of our textbook imaginations. As I zoomed further, the image stuttered. A glitch I assumed came from the software. Then it repeated, almost rhythmically. The lattice shimmered, not in brightness but in orientation, as though its internal symmetry was modulating at a slow, deliberate pace. I ran a Fourier transform. Peaks emerged exactly 4.2 seconds apart. Periodic, intentional, it felt like a pulse. My chest tightened. Signals from space are not new to science. Pulsars, magnetars, black hole jets, each emits rhythms that mimic intelligence to the untrained eye. But this was internal modulation from within a solid object, a modulation synchronized across multiple nodes of a crystalline lattice that should have been inert. I replayed the sequence again, and on the 15th cycle, a faint phase shift appeared. A slight alteration in the pattern, almost like a deviation inserted on purpose. I froze the frame. If this was information, if these shifts encoded a message, then 3i Atlas wasn't just drifting, it was broadcasting, Quietly, patiently, perhaps waiting, I leaned back, realizing the question was no longer whether the object was natural or artificial. The question was what it was trying to say, because the modulation wasn't random, it carried structure, and the latest frame, the one I haven't shown anyone yet, contains a shift so precise that it cannot be coincidence. And if I'm reading it correctly, no, not yet. The implications are too large, and the pattern is only beginning to reveal itself. I replayed the modulation sequence until sunrise, and by then the shift pattern had grown more pronounced. The nodes in the crystalline lattice inside 3I Atlas were not simply oscillating, they were synchronizing across spatial regions, forming gradients like wavefronts in a computational medium. When I overlaid the polarization map onto the Fourier output, the alignment became undeniable. The internal lattice was coordinating its energy emission, and the coordination followed a mathematical scaffold more elegant than anything humans have designed into superconducting systems. It reminded me of phase locking in neural clusters, only here the neurons were crystal junctions millions of kilometers from Earth. The next set of data arrived from the orbital spectrometers. I scanned it quickly, and the reflectance spectrum confirmed what our initial analysis hinted at. 3I Atlas was accelerating beyond predictions. Not by much, only a fractional increase, but enough that the standard jetting explanation no longer held. Natural outgassing creates irregular impulses. This acceleration was smooth, sustained, and perfectly aligned with the object's rotational orientation. Something inside the lattice might be generating a propulsion effect, even if small. A self-correcting course, a controlled drift, either possibility forced me to discard the comfort of old cometary models. Meanwhile, the community fractured visibly. One faction insisted that 3I Atlas was an artifact, a relic probe designed by a civilization far older than ours. They argued that the internal angles of the lattice matched high-efficiency energy flow geometries used in theoretical megastructure planning. Another faction fought back with new exotic matter models. They proposed a scenario where 3I Atlas passed through a magnetized protoplanetary disk that imprinted a molecular carbon superlattice on its nucleus. The collisions, ionization, and gravitational shearing could have aligned the carbon chains into a crystalline macro network. Beautiful, but even they privately admitted the precision defied natural processes. I listened to both sides, but the modulation remained the pivot in my mind. Nature expresses rhythm through symmetry, but intention expresses rhythm through interruption. And the deviation I observed, so sharp, so deliberate, felt like a punctuation mark. Yet I refused to claim intelligence without proof. I've been criticized enough times for being too bold, but boldness without rigor is mythology, not science. Late that night, I retrieved the enhanced reconstruction from the EELT team. Beneath the primary lattice and secondary filigree, a tertiary structure appeared, almost imperceptible but unmistakably patterned. It was fractal, not fractal in the chaotic sense of clouds or coastlines, but in the engineered sense. Nested geometries repeating in decreasing scales designed to maximize informational density. A cosmic hard drive would require exactly such an architecture. Small-scale nodes for high-frequency storage, mid-scale channels for modulation, and a large-scale skeleton for stabilization. The more I stared, the more it resembled a circuit whose purpose remained obscured by time and cosmic erosion. Suddenly an alert flashed on my console. A new burst of polarization asymmetry detected, much stronger than before. I loaded the sequence and watched the lattice brighten in discrete pockets, each pulse forming a pattern like constellations rearranging themselves. The bursts occurred in packets, 3 long, 1 short, 3 long, repeating. I measured the intervals, 4.2 seconds again, the same periodicity, but now structured. I ran a binary mapping out of instinct, but the pattern refused to translate cleanly into any conventional encoding scheme. Still, something about the rhythm felt familiar. Not Morse, not binary, not any human language, but reminiscent of computational handshake protocols, the kind machines use before exchanging data. If this was a handshake, then something inside 3I Atlas was initiating contact, not with us specifically, but with any capable receiver. a beacon designed to awaken when encountering a sympathetic analytic system. As I prepared the next layer of analysis, one detail seized my attention. During each modulation cycle, the lattice shifted toward a configuration that matched simulations of superconductive qubit alignment. Qubits require coherence. Coherence requires purpose, and purpose suggests an operation is underway, perhaps an operation triggered by our observation of it. I hesitated before documenting that last thought. If true, it raises a question I am not prepared to answer. Was the signal waiting for us? Or worse, did our instruments activate something dormant inside the crystalline brain? The final frame of the newest sequence contained a new deviation. Sharper, cleaner, too precise to ignore. And its ratio, I recognized it instantly. The message was changing, and it was beginning to respond. The moment the deviation matched the ratio I recognized, I felt a chill rise through my hands, as if my own nervous system were reacting to the lattice inside 3I Atlas. The ratio was the golden mean, phi, embedded in countless biological structures, architectural designs, and computational optimizations. But here it appeared not as an aesthetic accident. It functioned as a scaling parameter between the primary and tertiary nodes of the crystalline lattice. That implied a process, an intentional optimization of energy flow, information density, or both. I couldn't say it out loud yet. The scientific community was already fracturing under the weight of implications and revealing that the lattice encoded a universal constant would split them further. I examined the newest transform. The periodic modulations grew more complex with every cycle, now forming asymmetries that resembled nested sequences. Some sequences rose in amplitude like questions, others flattened as if waiting for resonance. If this pattern belonged to a natural exotic phase, it was the most articulate natural process I'd ever encountered. If it was engineered, then the sender anticipated interpreters capable of pattern recognition, but not bound by human encoding traditions. By morning, the global debate had erupted. The Technological Origin Group published a preprint arguing that 3I Atlas might be a self-replicating probe whose crystalline brain was damaged or dormant. They suggested the lattice could house encoded stellar maps, biological archives, or even software routines meant to adapt to new environments. They pointed to the acceleration anomaly as evidence of onboard course correction. The opposing faction countered immediately, presenting quantum fluid models that could imprint structured superconductive lattices during encounters with extreme magnetohydrodynamic environments. Both sides selectively ignored the modulation. I couldn't ignore it. Something inside the object was behaving as though awareness, at least in a mechanical sense, was emerging or returning. When I aligned the pulses over a 12-hour period, the pattern revealed a slow drift, as if the modulation was recalibrating itself in response to our observation. And that terrified me far more than the possibility of extraterrestrial intent. Because if 3I/ATLAS was natural, and it still adjusted its behavior, then we had discovered a phase of matter capable of self-modulation, a property we associate with life and computation, not geology. Late that night, I received a secure message from the mission architecture team. They needed rapid confirmation. Should Daedalus 3I be reinforced against high-energy radiation? The new data suggested that the energetic environment around the object was not only elevated, but fluctuating, synchronized with the lattice pulses. If these fluctuations formed part of a handshake, Daedalus 3, I would be entering a variable radiation field that might spike unpredictably. I knew the mission demanded speed. 3I Atlas was accelerating, subtly but consistently. Every hour shaved off the timeline increased the odds of a successful flyby. But sending an unprotected craft risked losing the single opportunity humanity had to examine a crystalline brain directly. Nice, I answered cautiously. Reinforce shielding, recalibrate instruments, and adjust the rendezvous point. The shift in trajectory was small but unmistakable. The object was no longer drifting passively. It was behaving like something responding to forces we didn't yet understand. Whether internal propulsion, external interaction, or something more intentional, the distinction no longer mattered. The mission had to adapt. As I finalized the calculations, the latest modulation cycle appeared. This time, the lattice dimmed, almost like inhaling, before releasing a sequence of pulses so tightly spaced that the transform failed to resolve them individually. When the software recombined the data, a new pattern emerged. It was no longer periodic, it was layered, a matrix of harmonics stacked upon harmonics like chords played across multiple octaves. My pulse quickened. Harmonics indicated structure. Structure indicated encoding. The lattice was no longer merely oscillating. It was introducing a hierarchy of signals. I leaned closer, absorbing every frequency, every gradient. Then I saw it, embedded in the harmonic envelope, something subtle enough to miss unless you were looking for it. A pause, a deliberate, unmistakable pause between two harmonic clusters. If this was a message, then the pause was the equivalent of breath before speech. The pause lingered longer than any natural modulation should, and in that silence I felt the weight of something watching, not in the biological sense, but in the sense of a system waiting for conditions to align before continuing its operation. When the lattice resumed, the harmonic structure shifted from broad chords to narrow bands, like threads weaving themselves into a new pattern. Each band carried micro-oscillations that fluttered with a precision bordering on surgical. I knew instantly that Daedalus 3I's approach would no longer be a simple reconnaissance mission. It would be an encounter with a system that might adapt in real time. Mission control confirmed what I feared. 3I Atlas acceleration had increased again, still mild but undeniably deliberate. The vector change aligned perfectly with the new harmonic drift. This was no random jetting. Either internal superconductive flows were reorganizing themselves, or the crystalline brain was responding to the detection of our instruments. As I reviewed the latest trajectory models, the rendezvous window collapsed from weeks to days. The craft would need to adjust its slingshot around Jupiter, pushing its plasma drive harder than planned. Risky, but necessary. A new alert arrived, radiation spikes, not explosive, but rhythmic, matching the harmonic bands. Daedalus 3. I would need layered shielding if it hoped to survive the approach. I felt a pang of conflict. Every delay jeopardized the mission, yet every unshielded second near the object risked losing the only probe capable of revealing its secrets. Even worse, if the radiation pulses were part of a communication protocol, then shielding might distort the very signals we needed to interpret. I opened the packet from the remote sensing array. Inside was a reconstructed volumetric model of the tertiary lattice responding dynamically to the modulation cycles. As the harmonics intensified, the lattice nodes aligned into mirrored formations, almost symmetrical, almost bilateral. Nature rarely produces bilateral symmetry at a macroscopic scale in crystalline structures, but intelligence does, circuits do, logic structures do. The question shifted. Was 3I Atlas preparing itself, or was it preparing for us? I leaned closer as the render expanded. With each harmonic pulse, the tertiary lattice contracted inward, concentrating energy into a single axis, a directional orientation. If this was a message, that axis might point somewhere. If it was propulsion, then the object was about to accelerate again. If it was neither, then we were witnessing a physical process we had no language for. Then, without warning, the harmonics converged. The lattice flashed, bright enough to saturate the sensors. When the data settled, a new modulation appeared, a cluster of pulses arranged in ascending intervals. I counted them aloud, unable to stop myself. The sequence repeated. Same intervals, same structure. A staircase of signals climbing toward a conclusion I could feel before I understood. The crystalline brain wasn't just broadcasting, it was initiating something. And Daedalus 3, I was already en route, racing toward an object that had just begun to wake. The staircase sequence repeated a third time, and in its rising intervals I sensed intention, not in a sentimental way, but in the mathematical precision of each ascending pulse. It was as if the crystalline brain inside 3I Atlas was ramping toward a threshold. I ran a derivative analysis on the intervals, and the output formed a curve that mirrored coherence buildup in quantum systems. In our laboratories on Earth, this kind of curve precedes data stabilization, the moment before information becomes readable. Was the object preparing to reveal its content, or calibrating itself to our observational cadence? Daedalus 3 I crossed its final trajectory correction, plasma engines burning hotter than protocol allowed. The mission engineers reported thermal strain, but the craft held together. It would reach the approach corridor earlier than projected, just as the harmonic intensity inside 3I Atlas peaked. The timing was uncanny, too synchronized to brush off as coincidence. I stared at the overlapping graphs. The probe accelerating toward the object's lattice climbing toward coherence, two curves converging like participants in a long-delayed dialogue. Then the next modulation arrived and everything changed. The lattice did not pulse outward this time, it folded inward, fractal layers collapsing into a single axis of symmetry. When the collapse stabilized, the structure resembled a helix, elongated, crystalline, and aligned with the object's direction of travel. A helix is an efficient data structure, both compact and robust. The possibility that 3I Atlas carried encoded information no longer felt speculative. It felt inevitable. A new pattern surged through the lattice, sharp, discrete pulses separated by a constant temporal spacing. I measured the intervals, exact multiples of a universal constant found in atomic transitions. The message, if that's what it was grounding itself in physics, choosing a language that any advanced civilization would understand. Not words, not symbols, a foundation. My breath tightened as I watched the final segment of the cycle appear. 3 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses, another pause, 1 pulse. The oldest structure in communication, emphasis. Daedalus 3. I transmitted a health ping as it entered the object's extended radiation envelope. The signal was weaker, but stable. Seconds later, the crystalline helix brightened, as if acknowledging the probe's presence. I leaned in, heart pounding, listening to the rhythm align with the probe's telemetry. For the first time since this began, the modulation did not lead the probe's signals. It followed them, adjusting its timing by fractions of a second, a synchronization attempt. And just as the probe crossed inside the threshold where our sensors started to saturate, the lattice emitted one final harmonic sweep, broad, elegant, resonant enough to bleed into every wavelength we monitored. The sweep encoded a pattern we had seen only in fragments before, a repeating symmetry that matched computational instruction sets, start markers, the kind placed at the beginning of stored information. I felt something between awe and dread, because the crystalline brain of 3I Atlas was no longer warming up, recalibrating, or signaling blindly into the void. It was opening. And the first data packets, whatever they contain, will reach Earth in less than 5 years. Humanity will soon learn whether we uncovered a relic of nature's impossible physics or the first message ever sent across the stars.